For where the eternal is, there is rest, but there is unrest where the eternal is not present. There is unrest in the world, but above all there is unrest in a man's heart if the eternal is not in it, and he is only sated with unrest. But if diversions, under the pretense of driving away this unrest, increase it, then will sufferings, which seem to increase the unrest, drive it away. The severe seriousness of the sufferings is at first like a disciplinarian who increases the disquietude, but if the sufferer is willing to learn, then he is precisely trained for eternity. For finding rest means being trained for the eternal. In general, there is only one way in which rest may be found, by allowing God to rule in everything. What more a man learns concerns how God has willed to rule. There is rest in the thought that there is reconciliation for the broken-hearted, but he cannot find rest in this eternal thought if he does not first find rest in the thought of obedience, that God must rule in everything, for reconciliation is precisely God's plan for man's salvation. There is rest for the repentant in the thought that there is satisfaction for guilt, but he cannot find rest in this eternal thought if he does not first rest in the thought of letting God rule in everything, for satisfaction is precisely God's plan from eternity. There is rest in the thought that God will forgive you, but you cannot find rest in this eternal thought if you do not rest in the thought that God must rule in everything. Otherwise, God's grace would become your merit, instead of it being the fact that it is God who gives both to will and to perform, gives the growth and gives the perfection, which all your own striving cannot accomplish. It cannot add 1 cubit to your stature, not an inch, which all your own self-concern cannot achieve. It only grieves the spirit and retards the growth. But faith and the obedience of faith in sufferings loves the growth up, because all the labor of faith is expended in driving out the ego, the selfish, so that God may really come, and so that he may be permitted to rule in everything. Indeed, the more that is suffered, if there is also more learned from the suffering, the more everything selfish is taken away, is eradicated, and obedience enters instead as the receptive soil where the eternal can strike root. You cannot take the eternal, you can only appropriate it to yourself, but you cannot appropriate to yourself that which is your own, only that which is another's. And again, you cannot appropriate this to yourself in a lawful manner unless he gives it to you. If, on the other hand, he wishes to give it to you, then is the appropriation inwardness. But with respect to God and the eternal, the appropriation means obedience, and in obedience there is rest. There is rest in the eternal. This is the everlasting truth, but the eternal can rest only in obedience. This is the everlasting truth for you. Therefore, as soon as you are disquieted, it is because you will not obey, but the suffering will help you to obey. Therefore, when there is suffering, but also obedience in the suffering, then you are being trained for eternity. Then there is no impatient longing in your soul, no disquietude, either of sin or of sorrow. As the cherubim with flaming swords stood guard to prevent Adam from returning to paradise, so suffering is the angel of salvation, who will hinder you from slipping out again into the world. Suffering is the school which will also keep you in school, so that you may be rightly trained for eternity. And as one of the old prophets has said, that the idolater carries his God, but the true God carries those who believe in him. So it is true of obedience. To let God rule in everything is precisely the true knowledge of the one true God. But what else is that than being trained for eternity? Whereas the idolater, be his false god what it may, drags himself to death in disobedience, in self-will, through wishing to carry his God. So the one who would learn obedience by the things he suffered is carried easily by God, as easily as only one is who is trained for eternity.